Hello and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptis. I will be the administrator for today's event on A House Divided. Welcome back. This is the first House Divided interview for the year 2023. So I know it's late, but Happy New Year to all of our fans of A House Divided. Last year, we sent you 18 live stream book signing events from A House Divided. I don't think we are going to do that this year, Daniel. I don't know if we're going to get it up to 18, but everybody wants to be on the show, so I'm not making any promises that we're not doing it.
I am Daniel Weinberg, and I'm sitting at home because of the snow that was coming, and I didn't want to be stuck in the shop. And Bjorn was in the studio where I usually am at. Before we get into the show, I just want to mention that today is the announcement of the Gilder Lerman Lincoln Prize from the Gilder Lerman Institute, along with the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. And we don't have the announcement yet. If we do during the show, we'll try to bring it to you. It's awarded each year to recognize the finest book of the year on the subject of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War era. Good luck. All the nominees this year to me were fine. And the nominees were Elizabeth Leonard, Benjamin Franklin Butler, Roger Lowenstein, Ways and Means, Lincoln and His Cabinet and the Financing of the Civil War, John Meacham, And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle, Jonathan White, A House Built by Slaves, African American Visitors to the Lincoln White House. And all four of those have been on our show, by the way, A House Divided, all four of them. And maybe that's why they're there, because we picked them. And finally, Rita Roberts, I Can't Wait to Call You My Wife, African American Letters of Love and Family in the Civil War. Those are the five nominees. One of them will win today. And all of them, including I Can't Wait to Call You My Wife, are on our shelves. And we have book plates for each of them, and no one is coming to the shop as yet, our authors. Next time, we'll have you, Michael, for your next book in the shop, hopefully. So they're for sale on our website, alincolnbookshop.com, with the custom signed book plates. So order your copies now, may as well, while we have them. So today we are really honored to have Michael Zuckert, who completed his master's and doctorate here at the University of Chicago. And he is now the Nancy R., I don't do French well, Drew Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame. He's an American political philosopher working in the fields of political theory and constitutional studies. According to your fellow University of Chicago graduate, Severin Darden, he said that he talked about an out-of-work philosopher being a philosopher who's not thinking at the time. So I'm glad you're working. You're also a clinical professor at Arizona State University during the retirement months, with I understand. Your previous books were Launching Liberalism, John Locke in the Liberal Tradition, The National Rights Republic, Natural Rights and the New Republicanism, The Spirit of Religion and the Spirit of Liberty, Lincoln and Democratic Statesmanship, and he's co-authored and co-produced a public radio series, Mr. Adams and Mr. Jefferson, a 9-part drama for the radio. I know you did a couple of books as well with your wife on Leo Strauss. But today's book, the latest, is from the series of constitutional thinking titled A Nation So Conceived, Abraham Lincoln and the Paradox of Democratic Sovereignty. It's a University Press of Kansas book, 397 pages, and is $34.95. The book focuses on speeches that Lincoln made during his career, placing them in a chronological order. And Michael speaks about the theory of democratic sovereignty, that all men are created equal, which has both a constructive and deconstructive potential. And you also explore the paradoxical duality of created equal. And I'm going to just say right off the bat, this is a consequential book. It's because it may change your perception of Abraham Lincoln, and we'll get to that in due time. But then we're going to bury that lead for the moment. So the organization of the book, how did you do that? Just give us a brief talk about what the organization was and how you picked those particular speeches, although a number of them are basic.
Yeah. Well, the organization is basically chronological. I mean, I begin with what's usually considered Lincoln's most consequential speech, the speech on the perpetuation of our political institutions, and then pretty much follow up on all the what seem, the most consequential speeches of Lincoln, although I deal even with quite a few which aren't normally considered that consequential, but I think in some cases they're more consequential than normally believed. For example, his eulogy for Henry Clay. I think that it turns out to be a more interesting speech than it's normally taken to be, and I hope readers will agree with me when they read my interpretation of it. But so I cover almost any speech you could think of by Lincoln of significance. Yeah, that was basically it. So from the perpetuation to the second inaugural, that's basically the structure.
And all put in the context of political theory and how he interpreted all that theory, which we will get to, and as well the eulogy. I just want to ask you this. Sanford Levinson did the book forward. He labels you a Straussian, which you wrote a couple of books with your wife, as I said, within the field of American political thought. Quickly, what is that, and is he correct? And should the readers have that in mind as they read it?
This is a very big question. What is Straussianism, and whether I really count this one? I mean, first of all, Leo Strauss was a professor at the University of Chicago, and he is a professor that I happened to study with when I was a student there. And he was well known for a number of things, none of which was the study of American political thought or American politics. He was himself German, and most of his interest was in European philosophy. And that's what I mostly studied with him. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, some of my work reflects an influence by Strauss, no question. But I think my work in American thought is not particularly related to Strauss. So no, I wouldn't necessarily want to take issue with my good friend Sandy Levinson, but I would say maybe that's a bit of a strong statement. The one place where maybe Strauss has some influence in the book is he was very well known for careful reading of things, and I think I did learn to read from him. And so there's some of the readings of the speeches may seem a little unusual to readers, and perhaps that reflects a kind of way of reading that I did learn a bit from Strauss.
That's one of the major reasons to read this book, to pick it up and read it and have on the shelf, because of other aspects you bring that not everyone else does, and is food for thought. By the way, something that he did, I don't know, criticize is a little bit too harsh, but he did pick up in the foreword that Frederick Douglass was missing from the book. He thought he should be there. Care to quickly respond?
Well, I mean, I had a certain path through the book. I had a certain thesis about Lincoln. I didn't aim to try to say everything anybody might know about Lincoln.
Right.
And Frederick Douglass just wasn't really central to the thesis I had. So I tried to actually avoid tangents and what seemed to me more things were extraneous to my book. Not to deny that Lincoln's relationship to Douglass was of some significance, but not to the theme I was pursuing.
Now, political theory can be somewhat dense to some people, but this book ain't that. You can
good.
read through this very well and understand what you're saying. You make your case and keep going forward with it. And I think that's superb. Now, you're right that Lincoln was always aware of the political context within which he was speaking. Could you just amplify that quickly?
Yeah, that's I see that as an important part of my book because I see there are two things I'm trying to do in the book that maybe are a little unusual. One, I try to deal with Lincoln's thought as a kind of unity. I try to bring out what is the core of it and how does that core play through all of his speeches. So I have I think a more connected presentation of Lincoln's work than one often sees in such studies. So that's one. And the other is I'm really interested to connect up his political acting and his speaking or thinking, so that I'm constantly concerned about what is the political setting of the speeches that he's giving. And it is interesting to note, as opposed to many other political thinkers, that most of what he says about politics is in a political context. They are public speeches. And so I'm always trying to take account of, well, what is Lincoln? What is the political moment in which he's speaking? What is his political goal in speaking as he does? What are the rhetorical needs that he faces in speaking with the audience, and so on. So there's a kind of intertwining in the way I've tried to deal with Lincoln between Lincoln as a political actor and Lincoln as a political thinker.
Well, in the title of your book is the paradox of democratic sovereignty. What is that concept? And you write, everything radiates from this concept.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think on this issue of democratic sovereignty, I take a cue from Lincoln's best known speech, Gettysburg Address, where he says, the U.S. is founded, the American founders brought forth this new nation dedicated to this proposition that all men are created equal. And so, so what does he mean by that? I think he means something, or I pretty much know that he means by that something like this. Nobody is born with a natural claim to rule any other person. No class basis, no race basis, no talent basis. So instead, legitimate government must follow from the consent of the governed, as the Declaration of Independence also tells us. And so Lincoln, I think, accepted this as the true teaching about the basis of politics. The true legitimate politics is politics that lives up to that demand. So if you were to say, well, Lincoln's theory, constructive theory of government, is this theory as expressed in what I call in my book democratic sovereignty, but it could also be called popular sovereignty. That is the claim that political authority derives from the people. I like to use the term democratic sovereignty because I want to distinguish it from Stephen Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty, which Lincoln saw, I think rightly saw, as a kind of distortion and misunderstanding and misapplication of the truth of democratic sovereignty. So in a brief word, the paradox of democratic sovereignty is that it was often in the course of American history misunderstood and misapplied in ways that led to the opposite kind of results from what the basic theory was actually would actually lead to if properly understood. So that's the paradox.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to jump a few things in here, but I want to ask about the judicial dilemma that you speak of in the Constitution, and how Lincoln responded to the judicial review and democratic sovereignty in regard, especially say to Dred Scott, which you bring out. And this is a problem, judicial supremacy versus judicial impotence, as you say. What was Lincoln's answer? Because it seems that he thought that the actions must be accepted for the present, but they don't bind the future.
Yeah, well, the issue, judiciary, the issue of the Supreme Court and the meaning of judicial review hit Lincoln especially hard because of the so-called of the Dred Scott case. And for listeners who don't know about the Dred Scott case, this was, of course, the case which raised the question: is the Missouri Compromise, was it constitutional? And this was an important question to Lincoln because he and the Republican Party at this time, 1857, that was their main policy goal, to reinstate the Missouri Compromise, or more broadly, to outlaw the presence of slavery in all the now unorganized territories of the United States. And if the Supreme Court opinion is correct, then the Republican Party has not much else to do but go home, because the policy goal they seek is according to the court, unconstitutional. So Lincoln, in trying to deal with this, in trying to raise the question, what can the Republican Party do in the face of this claim? Well, on the one side, he denied that the court had made a correct decision, and in order to avoid the challenge that Stephen Douglas and others were raising, that he was denying the authority of the law or the authority of the courts, he made an important distinction between the court decision as binding on the particular parties in that decision, and a court decision as a authoritative precedent for all other branches of the government and for all future. So he left us with a situation in which he and the Republicans were not challenging the outcome, the specific outcome in the Dred Scott case, that is the claim that Mr. Dred Scott and his family were still slaves, that the Missouri Compromise did not work to free them. But nonetheless, the other branches of the government were not precluded from re-raising the question, trying to persuade the court or persuade the country that this court case was wrongly decided and that it should be reconsidered. And you might say, I think of it as a kind of dialectical or back and forth kind of relation, debate in effect, between the court and the other branches. And that, as Lincoln saw it, that justified the Republicans going ahead with their policy goals of forbidding slavery in the territories.
Now, you brought up popular sovereignty with Stephen Douglas. And what did Lincoln object to in Douglas's popular sovereignty? And what were the solutions that he saw?
Yeah, well, so Lincoln understood the doctrine of what I'm calling democratic sovereignty, or what could be called popular sovereignty, to imply that the proper government, the right kind of government, was what he would call Republican government, which he translated as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That is self-government. That is, the same people who are governed are the people who do the governing. So this is self-government. Now, Douglas also understood popular sovereignty to mean self-government in a sense, and here's how he applied it. On the issue of slavery in the territories, which was the main substantive or specific issue that divided them, Douglas said, let's not decide this question in Washington. Let's decide it in each local territory. Each local territory should exercise self-government by deciding whether they're going to have slavery or not. Now, Lincoln saw this to be ridiculous and absurd because self-government, the theory of democratic sovereignty, rested on the claim that all men are created equal. And you cannot use this doctrine of democratic sovereignty to put up for a vote whether all men are created equal, because the whole basis of proceeding in that way is accepting the doctrine that all men are created equal. So Douglas's doctrine is a complete self-contradiction, and it undermines itself even before it can actually even be applied. So Lincoln thought, this was not merely a morally questionable doctrine, but a logically impossible doctrine.
There are a couple of other concepts in the book that we should go over.
Sure.
One is the problem of perpetuation. And you
Uh,
start out with a perpetuation speech, but also bring it up again when we get to the second inaugural.
mhm.
So the basic problem of perpetuation is the duality of the Declaration of Independence as to political rights, being both constructive and destructive. So give us the elevator talk on Lincoln's evolution of change from that youthful speech to the last major speech he gave.
Well, this is a big, this is mainly the whole book, so it's going to.
It is, but
So actually, Lincoln, over the course of his career, faced, I think, 4 versions of what I would call distortions or misjudgments, miscalculations about what the all men are created equal or what democratic sovereignty actually meant or implied. So one of which is the Stephen Douglas doctrine. So Stephen Douglas uses this doctrine, and Lincoln believed in Douglas's hands, the nation would, the survival of the nation was at stake, mainly in the sense that if Douglas's doctrine was accepted, then the United States was no longer committed to the doctrine that all men are created equal, because his, as I tried to say before, his doctrine of popular sovereignty denies it. But I think a more specific way in which he saw the nation collapsing through the application or misapplication of this doctrine was in the doctrine of secession, because as he saw it, secession was actually, or this, let me back up, the Southerners saw secession as a kind of implication of the doctrine contained in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration says legitimate government comes from the consent of the governed. And they then say, well, if it comes from the consent of the governed, as was visible in the ratification conventions for the Constitution and to join the Union, the Southerners thought, well, why can't we withdraw our consent and consent to leave the Union in the same way? And so interestingly, they had de-ratification conventions in effect, in which they more or less mimicked what they had done earlier to join the Union. And Lincoln points out that this is a dissolving rather than a constructive use of this doctrine. And again, he was able to point out there's something very contradictory about that, to say nothing destructive.
of course, the perpetuation of our political institutions was important to Lincoln positively. And actually, my own father, who was an immigrant, he was a psychoanalyst and gave many talks. And when he did, he always talked about our fathers. I said, Dad, I was born here, you weren't. If they're not in your blood,
Yeah.
how are they your fathers? But that's the electric cord that Lincoln speaks about, yes?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's one of his most moving passages, really, where he talks about the way the Declaration of Penance gives meaning to American citizenship, and that all of us, my mother was an immigrant also, and I think I personally feel that way, that we're all held together by the principles expressed in the Declaration, and America is a place constituted not by having descendants that go, or ancestors that go back, 1,000 years or something, but by our willingness to be constituted through this kind of idea of consent to the governed, rights, natural rights, and so on. So yeah, and he speaks of he speaks in one place, or actually more than one place, of 4th of July, and he says, well, about half the people are descendants of the original founders of the country, but the others aren't. They're like us. They were some children of immigrants, but that we're all held together by this principle that we can all agree to, and that we see as a source of hope and progress for all of us.
Well, is that Compact a political religion then? Is that what we are all about?
There are some who see it. There are some who see it that way. I don't know. Lincoln sometimes he spoke about a political religion. I think in his earlier work, he proposed this in his first speech, the perpetuation of our political institutions. The worry in that early speech was that there was a tendency towards mob rule in the country. And these mobs that he saw, these were not the people who go to, like Best Buy and steal television sets, but rather these are mobs which are substituting their action and judgment for that of the legal authorities. So they're people in effect who take the law into their own hands. And Lincoln saw this as connected with the idea of popular sovereignty, actually, but he also saw it as dissolving because it leads to a chain of events which how should we say, lead people to lose their affection for the government because it turns out to be ineffective for them. So he saw as a solution, or he called for as a solution, a political religion of obedience or reverence for the laws. In my interpretation of that speech, I argue that Lincoln, in fact, had misgivings about that solution, and in fact was not indeed committed to it. So that he had to come up with another solution as time went by.
Now, we talked about the word dedication, and in the Gettysburg Address, you point out that that word appears in all 3 paragraphs of that talk. How do you interpret that? And how is that perhaps a little different than some other historians, for instance, Gary Wills and
Yeah.
Thoreau, who also write on the address?
Yeah. Well,
Is a
Wills,
nation defined by that dedication?
so I think that the point of his appeal to the idea of dedication is something that has a projection into the future. It has a bearing both on it has a way of tying together the past, the present, and the future. And the Gettysburg Address, as a lot of people have noticed, is organized in that way. That is, the first paragraph is about the past, and the next paragraph is about the present, and then the third paragraph is about the future. And what Lincoln sees is that dedication to the principle all men are created equal is what holds together in America, past, present, and future. But one of the things he wants to argue is that dedication to that past proposition, all men are created equal, doesn't get frozen at the point that it was at the time of the American founding. So, for example, he calls for a new birth of freedom at the end of the Gettysburg Address, that new birth being an extension of the original dedication, that to make the original dedication good requires carrying it forward, extending it into the future, and extending it in new ways, meaning doing away with slavery. That was really the issue that he was getting at there.
Bjorn, you have something to say from the internet?
Yes, Dan, and even just because it's the first show of 2023, and just because we're deep in February, and just because it's snowing in Chicago, doesn't mean that we don't have people that want to watch A House Divided and hear about Abraham Lincoln. Maybe we have more of that. But yeah, I want to say hello to some of our regulars who are watching today, and we do have a question. Thomas Hassel is watching from South Central Pennsylvania. Hello. David Wiegers from Gurney, and Thomas Mackey from Indianapolis, and also Dave Bradley from the UK. And Dave Bradley has a question or a comment that we can hopefully get a response from Michael Zuckert. Dave wants to know, or he says, It seems to me that the Supreme Court's ruling on judicial matters must be considered as binding, regardless of how egregious we may regard the ruling. Otherwise, there is no point in having a Supreme Court. Thank you, Dave. And Michael, do you have a response on that?
Well, I think Lincoln would agree with that, but he'd make this distinction that I try to make between the outcome of the case, that is, in the decision with regard to the case at hand, that is binding, and he doesn't challenge that. Although he might think it was wrongly decided, but he doesn't challenge that. But he wants to say is the fact that the court decided today that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional doesn't mean that in the future we can't press that issue, continue to press that issue, in the hope that the Supreme Court will in fact come to see the error of its ways and correct itself. So there's often a distinction made between judicial finality, and that Lincoln would accept that, and judicial supremacy, the idea that somehow once the court has pronounced on an issue, no other branch of the government can counter what the court said, or even, even advocate against it. And that's what Lincoln disagreed with.
All right, that's all we have for now, Dan. So I'm going to send it back to you.
Okay.
I think it's time now that we get to a piece that's, I think, a crux in this book, one that I have advocated about and spoken about over the years and decades, and has been given short shrift by most historians until you have come along. And I jumped out of my skin when you started to talk about this and use it as something important. And that is a sentence from George Robert, the letter from Lincoln to George Robertson, who was a Kentuckian. And this is truly transformative. And the first to emphasize this, it was an August 15th, 1855 letter. And in it, among other things, Lincoln says, "There is no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us. There is no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us." Now, James McPherson, when I was speaking with him on this show 12 years ago or so, disagreed with the importance of this. You couldn't rely on one time Lincoln saying this. Well, as a son of a shrink, yes, I think one could certainly rely on something that comes out of left field and is revealed finally. Now, I was the head of, I was not head of, I was one of 72,000 advisors to the Lincoln Bicentennial in 09, but I was on the committee for making the medal. There were 4 medals that were to be made, coins from each of the states and Washington, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. There are 3 committees that had to do this, 2 outside us that were part of Treasury. And they showed us one they liked with Lincoln standing next to a cannon. Our committee spiked that and came down hard on that. We said we didn't want Lincoln to be known, or did we think he was a war president? Well, maybe we were wrong. And you have brought that forth from this one phrase, sentence in the Robertson letter. And of course, he spoke of a crisis, Lincoln did, in the House Divided speech, meaning perhaps war, that he thought would eventually bring about the end of slavery. So, should we now think of Lincoln as perhaps a war president, in the back of his mind, hiding behind William Seward, who had a more forceful stance? He hid behind that, but Lincoln had in his mind, if the crisis was war and it came, I'm going with it because I think that's the only way that we're going to get a chance to extinguish slavery in our country. Was he a war president?
I think I would say yes, although I think there's a lot of nuance to the issue as
I
well.
hope so.
Yeah. Uh, in a way, I came to see the significance of the Robertson letter. I mean, I had read it through. We all read it through, and then we don't know what to make of it. But when I was studying the House Divided speech and was thinking, so Lincoln gives us in the House Divided speech, the country faces two paths. It could go all free or it could go all slave. And he gives us a good analysis of the dangers facing us of going all free. All slave. And he gives a pretty clear account of how that might happen. But interestingly, he doesn't give any similar account to how we might go all free. And he gives a kind of, I would say, unpersuasive. He leaves us with an unpersuasive view. That unpersuasive view being, if we just outlaw slavery in the territories now, we'll go all free. And we'll put the public mind at rest that that's going to happen. And it seemed to me both parts of that were questionable. One, it didn't put the public mind at rest, that's for darn sure.
Wow.
But secondly, what was the mechanism, or what was the dynamic? What was the trail of events that would lead to all free from that? And it wasn't clear to me what that would be. And so I started to wonder whether he actually had much confidence in that as a solution. And it's at that
Well, we
point.
always say that it's because he will think that it will eventually die on the vine. Because to me, one of the most important, the most important act he did was not allow even his own party to cross the red line of pulling back about no slavery in the territories. There was to be none. That was his red line. And he would go to war for it. He was the first president to say, I'm going to do that. So it seems that when he was going against, the big controversy is whether Union, he was fighting to save the Union at the beginning. I think he was fighting to save the Union, but for a bigger purpose, not just Union, but to put slavery on the path of extinction, although we don't know how much longer that would be. And there might be numerous generations in between of African Americans who are going to suffer for that delay.
Yeah. But I think what Lincoln was counting on was the following, that because after the Dred Scott decision, the Southerners got much more ambitious for what they wanted. And they thought after Dred Scott, they thought they had a right to have slavery in the territories. And so when the Republicans resisted this, that led the Southerners ever more firmly to threaten to leave the Union. And I think, as opposed to, at least I believe, as opposed to many historians, that Lincoln took that as a serious threat, and that what he saw actually happening was, if we stand firm against the expansion of slavery into the territories, the Southerners will then leave, at least the Deep South, and he didn't know obviously how many would leave, and that would lead to a crisis. In fact, in the House Divided speech, he speaks of a crisis that must be reached, and I think that's the crisis that he actually saw. My understanding of this issue is furthered by a speech he gave in Cincinnati in 1859 in his, it was a sort of second Lincoln-Douglas debates, not quite, because they weren't on the stage in the same place, but where Lincoln was addressing, kind of in a very mock funny way, yelling across the Ohio River to the assembled, they weren't there, but he was pretending they were assembled Kentuckians, trying to tell them that Douglas really was their man, and that they shouldn't be mad at him because he's helping them along. But one of the things he talks about there is his anticipation, in fact, that if the Republicans win the presidency, the Southerners will leave the Union, and that the Southerners think that they can win a war easily. But Lincoln says, Lincoln indicates there, I think, his anticipation that there could be a war and that the North actually would easily win it. And I think he was mistaken in that judgment, but nonetheless, I think he was proceeding on that basis that the North, there would be a war and that the North could win it fairly easily. And
Well,
yeah,
let me ask you, do you think that without the slavery issue,
yeah.
he would have been as forceful about union and fighting to keep them in with us if slavery was not the ultimate issue?
I think slavery was I think from
Well, I do
Lincoln's point of
too,
view,
but if
slavery
that
was the
wasn't
issue
there,
from the start. I mean, that was always the issue.
yeah.
And I think in the war itself, slavery was the issue. But he also, Lincoln also had, Lincoln also had a tremendous respect for the Constitution. And I think he saw that there were limits to what he could do as president to bring about the end of slavery. So there it becomes a complicated question. I try to give an account, a speculative account of how Lincoln might have seen slavery ending according to his way of proceeding. But yeah, I mean, it's speculative, and
Yes.
I won't spoil the thing by giving it away now.
Well,
But
a nation so conceived, Abraham Lincoln and the paradox of democratic sovereignty and what we're talking about. And I think this is an important work from what you've been hearing these last 45 minutes.
thank you.
Speaking of the Constitution,
Yeah.
habeas corpus, many think that he violated the Constitution with some of his habeas corpus acts and even closing down some newspapers. But you claim that Lincoln actually followed constitutional rules. What
Mhm.
was the constitutional plausibility that allowed him to do that?
Yeah, well, the main argument against Lincoln on this is the following, that the provision about habeas corpus that's in the Constitution is part of Article 1, which article is about the legislature, about Congress. And so people infer from this that it's Congress has the power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and not the president. And Chief Justice Taney, in his opinion on the habeas corpus issue, that was his main reliance, and I believe that's understood to be the main reliance even today by most legal scholars. However, it's not true that Article 1 is only about the legislature. Article 1, Section 9, which is the important provision in this case, it actually has provisions limiting the executive as well as Congress. And so I think that simple fact means that the main argument used against the habeas corpus, against Lincoln's use of the habeas corpus, is false. And I think Lincoln's broad argument that the commander-in-chief clause is actually the source of the president's power to suspend under the conditions laid out in Article 1, Section 9. I find that's a persuasive argument, and that's what I try to defend in the book. Some in more detail than I'm giving now, but
Yes, of course. Well,
yeah.
they have to go and read the darn book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Ward Lerman, who was a legal lawyer, good friend, a colleague of Abraham, and in a book, he wrote in a book years ago that he had in the margins, Holland's book, Biography of Lincoln in 1866, when Holland talked about his honesty, Lincoln's honesty. He was so honest. Ward wrote in the margin, Lincoln could stretch the truth when necessary.
Yeah,
What do you think about that?
I agree. I mean, I think Lincoln, he was basically an honest man, but he was a politician. He didn't say everything he had in mind. And I think sometimes he had in mind, well, I mean, I know many times he had in mind more things than he was saying, and sometimes he misled people as to what he had in mind. So, for example, on the issue that we were talking about a little bit earlier, I think he saw a war as the likely outcome with regard to slavery, and not whatever other speculation he had about how slavery might end, if only we could prohibit slavery in the territories. So that would be, I think, the most important case that I can think of, where Lincoln wasn't saying the whole truth.
Mhm. All right. Now you speak about Lincoln as a poet,
Yeah.
but not really a philosopher. But is there no philosophic meaning in poetry, in the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural? They're not just pretty words. There's something behind them, no?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't recall that I said that he was a poet and not a philosopher. I see him as quite philosophical. In fact, what I argue on this particular issue is this, that Lincoln had a rational case in favor of the proposition that all men are created equal. But he came to see that pure reason has a limited effect in public life. And he came to see that what we need, that reason may lead us to truth or lead to truth in some abstract way, but what leads people to belief and action is feeling. And so Lincoln saw that he had to appeal to the feeling of the people. And he came to therefore understand that his rhetoric had to have a kind of poetic character to it. But it was a poetry in the service of, I think, in the service of a philosophic understanding. So I would say it wasn't an either or at all. It was a both and.
Mhm.
And he was unmastered in this area. Just, wonderful.
But you speak about the Henry Clay eulogy
Mhm.
earlier on, and of course he gave one for Zachary Taylor as well. How was he as a eulogizer, and were there any commonalities that he used?
Well, it's interesting. His eulogy of Clay, which I think is the more important. Um, one of the interesting things about the Clay eulogy, and for those those of us who are teachers, we might notice this. So the first about a third of the Clay eulogy is quotation from a eulogy written by written in a newspaper, a Democratic Party newspaper, praising Clay, who was the leader of the opposition party to the Democrats. So that was unusual, and Lincoln defended his use of this Democrat, so much text from the Democratic writer, in terms of, well, how effective it is that the writer of an opposite party should be praising Clay. Those of us who are teachers think, well, this is like a student who has, he has to write 10 pages, and so he has to find some way to fill up all those pages. And I think the speech is often read that way, but I argue that in fact, what Lincoln is doing is he's showing us that the issue the country faces now, and let me back up and say this. When Clay dies, 1852 is the eulogy for Clay. When Clay dies, this is a kind of symbol of the passing from the American political scene of what I like to call the second generation of great political leaders. The founding generation, maybe the death of Madison in 1836 kind of represents that. They're now off the scene. With the death of Clay, that's next generation, Webster, Clay, Calhoun, that group now is off the scene. So the question is, what is the next generation of American statesmen got to be? And as I interpret it, that's what that Clay speech is actually about. And what I think Lincoln is trying to show in that speech is that Clay, in fact, is not the model of statesmanship that we need for the next generation. And he lays out a kind of agenda for what the next generation statesman ought to be, that he turns out to fill pretty well. It isn't clear to me that he meant himself to actually take that role at that time, but that's the role he ended up taking. So he uses the eulogy in a way to praise Clay, although under the surface to criticize Clay a bit. But he also uses it to lay out, he's thinking about what the next generation of statesmanship must be like.
Well, he had ambition and
He did.
maybe a touch of hubris in that.
Yes.
If he did feel unconsciously that he might be part of that next generation, and he turned out to be that. So
Yes.
he wasn't wrong. In the House Divided speech, controversial, of course, because of a House divided against itself cannot stand, and many of his colleagues thought he should strike that out. But he felt that maybe talk about that phrase and also how he used that speech to teach, educate the public to care about slavery and its extinction.
Huh. Yeah, that's a good question. So this was in a way a speech. This is interestingly a speech that he kind of he had like a focus group before he delivered it, and among some of his friends, colleagues, who mostly they advised him not to use the speech or not to use it as written, because they thought that it might sound to people, as it ended up doing, as if he was calling for some sort of sectional warfare. This was a common reaction to that speech, and people thought that was too provocative. And Lincoln denied that was the point of it, and he had a kind of, all kinds of reasons. And interestingly, he says in one place that if all of the other things, if all of the things he had written, except this one speech, was all that was left, that's what he would do. He would preserve this speech above all the other stuff he had done, which is pretty interesting, pretty strong statement. And I think, in a way, he did use the speech sort of in the way his focus group worried about. That is to say, he led everybody to see how much was at stake in the way things were going. That, and I think both sides, though, I think the Southerners also were kind of tipped off that how much was at stake in this issue about slavery in the territories. So I would say the speech did, in fact, give some impetus to the coming of the crisis that he talks about in that speech as what was going to have to happen.
On colonization,
Yeah.
here's Bjorn, but let's get this through real quickly. And I spoke with John Meacham a few weeks ago when I interviewed him for his book, and he reminded us that colonization really is a very racist policy. So my thought was, gosh, to me, Lincoln used colonization because he actually deeply feared the two races could not live together absence of their past, what their relationship was. It ain't gonna work. So he thought maybe we should separate. But I don't see that meaning that Lincoln was a racist. I mean, he was a 19th century man, but he certainly, I didn't see him as a racist. I don't think Frederick Douglass did later either, especially. But I think the fear was there. What is your thought about Lincoln and colonization?
I would say yes to that, but I would go beyond, I think, what you're saying in the following way. Lincoln saw that the distaste, if not more, for the two races living together was just a strong sentiment in the North, as well as certainly in the South. And he saw colonization that is, the leaving of the United States by the former slaves as a prerequisite to liberation of the slaves. And I think for Lincoln, it was more important that we undo slavery, both for the slaves, for the enslaved, and for the white population, than it was whether they lived together or not.
Mhm.
And I think personally, Lincoln was more open to the idea of them living together, and perhaps he thought it would be possible, but he didn't think emancipation would be possible if the prospect of a biracial society is what would necessarily follow for, people would draw a line there. No, we don't want that. We don't want that. A lot of, in the North, for example, there was a lot of opposition to slavery, but there was equally opposition to the biracial society. And so the preaching of colonization was one way to respond to that. So if you care about emancipation, then the idea of colonization should at least make a certain kind of sense.
Bjorn, you have stepped in. It must be getting close to
We're-
closing time, although I
getting-
have another point to get to after.
Well, we're getting
go
close
ahead.
to closing time, but that was a good question, Daniel, because Clinton Stockwell has already, even before you asked it, came up with a good follow-up question for that. So here's Clinton Stockwell for you, Michael, and he wants to know how, now that we have this, the idea of the separation of the races on our minds, how expansive was Lincoln's vision of all men being created equal? Women, indigenous people, immigrants?
I think it was completely expansive. I mean, for one, Lincoln himself talked about early in his career, talked about incorporating women fully politically in the country in a way that they hadn't been. It's not something he follows up on particularly, but it seems to me serious. Mr. Dismissed David Donald thought he was joking or something. I'm not sure about that. But one thing at a time. I think that became Lincoln's policy. We can't deal with every issue at the same moment. But Lincoln made a distinction that I think is important, which is to say, all people are created equal, but that doesn't mean that they all should live together or can comfortably live together. And so he wasn't necessarily committed to the idea, that if we end slavery, the freed people have to live here in America. He wasn't necessarily committed to that. He didn't think necessarily that this would be the best outcome for the freed people either, that they might do better with in their own community, where they would, the memories. I think in this regard, he did have a bit of a sense, as Daniel was saying, a bit of a sense that Jefferson had, that the history of slavery between the two peoples would stand in the way of their really comfortably living together. Jefferson really believed race war would be or seemed to believe that anyway, that race war would be the result. I'm not sure Lincoln thought that, but so Lincoln thought, and I don't know, maybe isn't he right, that all men are created equal doesn't mean that all men have to be fellow citizens.
Yet the African Americans, the freedmen especially, felt that they were American. They didn't want to go
Yes.
back anywhere. They belonged here, even though
Yes.
they had been enslaved. And that
Yes.
changed Lincoln a bit on colonization, certainly.
Yes, I think so. And I think one of the things Lincoln came to appreciate was that the freedmen themselves didn't want to leave. They felt they had a right, and I think he probably accepted that. They had helped. They had built America as much as anybody, and they had a right to be part of it. And so, at the end of his life, it's clear he was not pushing colonization really at the end. So he was prepared to somehow have a biracial society.
Hey, thank you to Clinton and everybody for chiming in. It was great to see you today. Daniel, do you have any last thoughts or any other things that you want to get to before we wrap?
Well, perhaps I'll go to one more thought that I had, and then maybe Michael, if you have a closing thought of some sort on something we've missed, something you'd like to say, but there's yours, I think, is part of a number of books that have been coming out recently on Lincoln's relevance to today. And John Avlon, John Meacham, among others, have brought this up, that Lincoln might help us during today's national problems. And I'd like you to speak maybe to Lincoln's historical role in processing solutions and keeping America a republic, a small r republic democracy, keeping in mind, of course, the dangers inherent in republicanism.
Yeah, well, this is a big topic actually. I've thought a fair amount about it. In a way, one of the things I would say is, so we think about Lincoln in this context because we think of our time as a very polarized time, and Lincoln was somebody who faced an even more polarized time than this, and in a way, what? So I want to see, well, here's Lincoln, great president, great man. And he helped us in this time. And I think one of the things that we have to actually notice is that he did not succeed in overcoming the polarization of his time. That is, it played out in a very harsh sort of way, part of which he contributed to himself, I think. But I think he does give us some good advice, hoping that we can come to an outcome less severe than he faced. One such thing is to take seriously his the so-called temperance address, where he talks about the way in which people should deal with their opponents, their political opponents or other kinds of opponents. And he gives, I would say, advice. It's best to avoid demonizing one's opponents. And that's, I think, good advice. He tried to follow that all the time. Didn't always work out for him, but he generally tried to follow that. Another piece of advice he gives, I think, that remains important, and I think has stood us well, actually. Believe in the Constitution, follow the Constitution, accept rule of law, things of that sort. They seem kind of, I don't know, corny, maybe, but I think they were really important. And I think some of the things that we've recently gone through, we got through them because we actually did stick to the Constitution, and I'm hoping that that will be our safeguard into the immediate future. So I would say those are a couple of things. There are others, obviously, but a couple of things that we might take from Lincoln as helpful to us.
Well, Michael Zuckert, thank you so much for this, for taking time with us about, I think, an important book. And the Robertson letter alone makes it important to me. So I'm really happy with it. And we have book plates. I think Bjorn has one there he can show. And if you purchase this book, you will get a signed book plate. Our logo on there was from Carl Sandburg, and we're proud of going back to that legacy as well. Michael, thank you so much. I'm going to give you off now to Bjorn.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Michael. I join Dan in saying that. And I want to thank everybody that's watching this on our live stream, on our Facebook live stream. Thank you for participating. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the questions, Dave and Clinton. And I want to remind everybody that you can order this book, Michael P. Zuckert, A Nation So Conceived, Abraham Lincoln and the Paradox of Sovereignty, from our website. And the link to do that is pinned in the comments of this live stream. You may be watching this later on our YouTube channel, and I will provide you with a link in the description at the YouTube channel where you can click through and order a first edition copy of A Nation So Conceived with custom signed bookplate by Michael P. Zuckert.